And by that, I'm really excited to leave the word to our moderator for today, Hanna Karlsson-Potter, working here as a researcher at the Department of Energy and Technology. And you are also one of the selected researchers that joined the Future Lab in 2020. So please, the floor, I was going to say, but it's not. The space is yours, Hanna, please.
Thank you. Yes, I was asked to give a very short introduction to why I joined the first part of the Future Lab as one of the 6 researchers there. And my work is on environmental system analysis of both food systems and bioenergy systems. And there we deal with the future perspective, I would say, in many ways, but we're not always thinking about it. It can be, for example, future resource use, future land use, future technologies for biofuel sector, for example, and potential of these, and availability studies of biomass in the future for different applications and so on. So therefore, that's the reason to why I wanted to join and learn more about how we can think about these aspects in research. I also had some experience from before. I had from my master's, where I in agroecology, where we did some visioning work together with, for example, people in Tolga in not northern Norway, but quite far north in Norway, as a project work. So I had some thoughts and ideas what it could be about, but I was curious, and that's why I joined. And then in the Future Lab, I got to meet, of course, other researchers with similar interests, but from different fields at SLU, and we got to learn together about future studies and different approaches or methodologies, if you want. And most of the participants also made small project works, but I went on parental leave before that happened, so I didn't do that, unfortunately. So today I will present the speakers of today's webinar, and that is Garry Peterson. He is a professor at Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University. He's also part of the team working on the scenarios for the MISTRA Food Futures. And Garry has worked on ecological futures for more than 20 years. And today his presentation is titled Nature Futures. Next is Susanna Barrineau, who is a PhD researcher at the University of the Sunshine Coast of Australia. And she's in the MISTRA Environmental Communication Program. She's also an associate at the Department of Urban and Rural Development here at SLU. And her project is called Carefully Creating Agriculture Futures, Exploring Relationships and Experiences Entangled with Carbon Farming. And today her presentation is titled Expanding the Possibilities of the Present with Future Thinking. So with that, I will leave the word to Garry.
All right, thank you. And then, oops, sorry, I need to go like this, and okay, now I think, yeah, so now I'm going to start. So I'm going to talk about nature futures, and I was just going to introduce myself a bit. Like, I've been doing future stuff for a long time, and I come at this a bit from initially an engineering background, where I was fortunate as a young engineer student to be in a weird department where we're introduced to post-normal science and thinking about how to navigate these situations where there's a lot of uncertainty and high decision stakes. I then worked on the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in the early 2000s, which is the first attempt to make global nature-oriented scenarios, and I was one of the authors of those. And I've done a bunch of different things, and two things I'm not going to talk about today, but touch on the talk today are a project we have on a kind of a bottom-up scenario approach called Seeds of a Good Anthropocene, which will pop up a bit, And another one is to creating an online database of existing social ecological scenarios to try and build a community of practice around people working on the connections between people and nature at local level around the world. So what I'm going to talk about, though, is this work I've been doing with IPBES to think about the future of nature. So I'm going to quickly give some background to this, and then I'll slow down if people are getting worried I'm going too fast. So basically, the situation is today, as I'm sure everyone knows, is that globally, economic activity that supports all of us is unraveling the web of life that supports all of us and the entire living world. However, dominant global scenarios, such as the SSPs from the IPCC, looking at climate futures, or indeed the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment scenarios, all foresee continued decline in the living world. And we know this doesn't have to be the case. Recent analysis have showed with pretty transformative action, we could have a thriving biosphere and a thriving, more equitable society. And the world's governments are sort of now are trying to have a meeting to agree on a post-2020 framework for nature, which is broadly already agreed that by 2050, the world's people should be living in harmony with nature. However, these past global agreements about biodiversity have been failures. That basically very few of the goals have been achieved, and of course, the decline of the living world has accelerated. The CBD has this kind of very weak, has this great goal of living in harmony with nature and recognizes the current status that biodiversity is impaired, but there's a big gap between how we go from where we are today to this future. And now this is where IPBES comes in. So I was part of this assessment of the state of scenarios and models that came out in 2016. And this identified this lack of nature futures that were looking to pathways where we actually achieve the goals that people have for nature. And our task force is not making new scenarios, but we're aiming to catalyze the development of new scenarios and models. And we're approaching these scenarios at a global level, but quite different from how the IPCC or the Millennium Assessment has approached scenarios. On the left here, what they do is they take the world as being driven by change, which is perceived kind of to be external to what's happening in the world, that's coming down to have some impact on people and nature. IPBES is taking an approach, which is that people and nature, people are embedded within nature, and our activities, our decisions are shaped by what's going on with nature, and that we need to do this at multiple scales. And we have a mandate or a requirement that we also need to include Indigenous and local knowledge in our activities. So we've sort of shifted from drivers looking to impact on nature to looking at what could be pathways to desirable futures at multiple scales. So now I'm just going to take a pause. So this is all talking about scenarios, and this figure I'm showing is from that assessment I mentioned from IPBES. This talking about there's a variety of different ways that people use scenarios, and just to kind of make things clear, I think it's good to go through this. Is that often people are aware of exploratory scenarios where there's thinking about, well, let's think about a few different futures and think about what could be going on and how that affects the decisions we're making today, and this is used for setting agendas. What should we worry about? There's also, though, target seeking scenarios for saying, like, what kind of pathways could we take to achieve a goal? And there's policy screening scenarios, which are saying, like, well, if we test these policies, how do we fare at achieving a goal? And as well as retrospective evaluatory scenarios. So these are all different types of scenarios. What we're trying to do in IPBES is more target-seeking scenarios. And to just give an example of this, I mentioned before, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment or exploratory. MISTRA Food Futures right now, which I'm involved with, is doing target-seeking scenarios of how we achieve Swedish food targets. Policy screening can be used to develop policy, saying, well, what are you actually doing? Is it going to achieve the goals you want to achieve? And you can look at how well you did with past policies to learn to how to do things in the future. All sorts of different types. So for us, though, one of the other things that comes up, and maybe you already thought about it. So this global goal of living in harmony with nature. Well, what is nature and what is harmony are the obvious questions. And in the Convention on Biological Diversity and all these global discussions around nature, there's very strong for a long time conflict between kind of the sustainable use of nature versus nature's own right to exist or conservation. And over the last maybe 10, probably more 20 years, there's been the rise of, more recently very pushed by Latin America, of this kind of the need to think of Earth as sacred, but more broadly recognizing the cultural aspects of nature. So these are all in discussion with one another, and there's an increased recognition of the need to think about plural value systems and multiple metrics when thinking about the living world. And then the other point is, as I kind of already alluded to, nature is declining, and the IPBES Global Assessment has concluded, this is a paper summarizing it, is that the pervasive human-driven decline of life on Earth, responding to this requires transformative change. So this isn't changing the tax rate or the interest rate or making a few new parks. It's doing a whole bunch of things differently. And this is a challenge for models or for scenarios, because transformation means that the world will work differently in the future, and the things that dominate the world today will not dominate this future world, which makes it hard to model or conceive about it. So to think about what a world where nature is thriving is look at, we have to ask what would have to grow, what has to decline or die, how could tensions be navigated? And the approach we use in IPBES is from the Seeds of the Good Anthropocene project, which was trying to think, what are existing things that exist in the world that people think could be exemplars of a more desirable future, things that could grow to become this more living in harmony with nature. And of course, these kind of initiatives, different people have different preferences for what they think is good, what is desirable. And they think about, they embody different values. And so just across the bottom here, there's some examples that people considered as sort of urban renewal, of removing a highway in downtown Seoul, backing up of global seed banks in Svalbard, Indigenous people asserting their governance over land in Canada to establish tribal parks, or linking poverty alleviation with ecological restoration and sort of biosecurity in India, just as examples of seeds. So, and why we do this, I think, is three kind of ideas that I like, at least. So sort of the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics was Elinor Ostrom. And in some ways, what she was famous for is showing that the tragedy of commons, which is a dominant economic theory, actually often doesn't occur in practice when people are able to talk with one another. And her students coined this idea of a law of the things that work in practice should be able to work in theory. And this is the problem of theory, not of world. So it's like you can find things in the world that don't match with theory, but exist and persist. It's maybe useful to think about them. Science fiction author William Gibson, his famous quote about the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. We take this to go look at the margins, not at the mainstream, to kind of find interesting things. And cultural critic Mackenzie Wark has written about the Anthropocene, of saying we need to find new ancestors. So if we're going to think about the future, we need to think about it growing out of different parts of the past than what has brought us to this current conflict. So we did this through a series of meetings, especially one in New Zealand, where we tried to bring together a bunch of seeds from representatives of people in these discussions all over the world to think about how they could grow different sets of people living in harmony with nature. We used a bunch of methods, which I won't go into, from sort of futures of bringing these seeds together and thinking at how they could grow together to make a more cohesive future. And from these, we created a set of visions, which we then kind of tested and added to over a whole big series of international engagements. And when we had these, we wanted to look at them. If you bring up these things of sacred spaces, rights of nature, property rights, technology, different types of values, how do you organize them together? And so we tried to make a framework that was complex, but as simple as possible, which we call the Nature Futures Framework, to represent these three types of approaches to nature, which I've already alluded to, of the value of nature for society, so the benefits that people get from society, things like ecosystem services, of food production, of climate regulation, of flood regulation, the nature for nature, the intrinsic right of nature to exist, of animals to evolve, of rivers to move, of elephants to migrate, and then nature of culture, how people exist as part of landscapes, whether this is the red stugas in the forest of Sweden, or the cultural landscapes of the south of France, or Sami in the Arctic, or people living in the Brazilian rainforest, where their identity, people's identity, cultural practices, ways of life, and systems of knowledge are actually literally embedded in the landscape. And the idea of this framework is not that one of these perspectives is right or one that should win, but that all of these perspectives are present everywhere. But the balance or dominance between these nature perspectives varies from place to place. So that this is trying to have thinking about all three things at once with thinking about the future. So what does this mean? So when we say we're thinking about nature's futures, we're trying to elaborate them. And this requires sort of monitoring, translating, developing new scenarios or futures, and working with modelers who model nature, model the economy, to develop new models that can report on all of these kind of pluralistic values. So for people, some people might think, well, we know a lot about nature for nature, but really most models are very much about the human benefits, very little about either the nature as culture or nature for nature. So just to give some examples, that this has been trying to be applied in an urban context. We're thinking about, well, if you go to these kind of extremes in an urban context, what types of living in harmony with nature would you have, and how would they differ from one another? We've also tried to develop some global illustrative scenarios to think about, well, what are some of the key tensions between, say, these dominant discourses around the global environment, between, say, post-growth economies versus green growth, land sharing versus land sparing, whole earth versus half earth, and thinking about how those things would play out and what kind of tensions exist. And these are not meant to be used like the SSPs, but to help people do their own scenarios. And then we've worked at translating existing scenarios. This example from Japan, where they've done a lot of big inventories of assessing the state of nature and people, and they developed scenarios. And we've translated into the Nature Futures Framework to look at how Japan has changed and is expected to change in terms of these different nature values. And so this is showing some graphs here, but I think one of the things, so this is something I was involved with, and one of the things that was the most useful for this is that in the historical assessment, these biocultural or nature's culture values are super important in Japan. This is about both in terms of like cherry blossoms, but also in their data sets, they had data on the decline of the number of spirits that are worshipped in shrines around Japan. But in their modeling going forward, they didn't have any data on all of these things that were actually quite important in their historical ones. And doing this translation identified this big gap for them, which was maybe the useful part. And then we've applied this in more grounded futures work of, say, an attempt efforts to design a new national park in the Netherlands, which is an urban park on the coast in the Netherlands, which is trying to link together high biodiversity for the Netherlands, cultural heritage, and economic and social values in a way that reinforce one another. And in that context, people try to think about how different sets of good practices in the present could grow into different types of futures, all of which are desirable, with the idea of not that you're forecasting these futures, but trying to identify mechanisms where you can ameliorate trade-offs and benefit from synergies. So this is all ongoing. I'm not talking about, there's a lot of work going on with modeling, which is very challenging, but this also very exciting because the modeling of biodiversity is moving very quickly. And there's a lot of activity also around finance and investments for thinking about these new approaches to nature and people. Then finally, I would like to step back a little bit. And I think we're doing this online, which is maybe one of the positive things from COVID. But in many ways, COVID, to remind people, is really part of this biodiversity crisis. The figure here on the right is showing the biomass of mammals on the planet. So most of the mammals on the planet, most of the meat of mammals is us and our animals. There's very little wild animals. And scientists have been predicting for years the type of pandemic that is COVID. And we can really expect this is only the first of many 21st century Anthropocene surprises we will face. And this is where I think futures thinking is really important, because trying to create a more desirable future requires transformation. But how do we transform? It requires both thinking about what we want to sustain and maintaining the parts that we want to sustain of this, imagining how we can decrease the resilience of pathological systems that are pushing us towards negative futures, and building the capacity to anticipate or change, which is partly imagining that change could be possible. And this is just where I'm going to end, is that it's to always remember that the surprise and crisis means that the future is not determined. And this means that bad things can happen, but it also means that positive things can happen. And that by exploring and thinking about more positive futures, even if they're not the least likely ones, we can make them more likely to occur. So this is with this IPBES Nature's Futures. We're not trying to identify what's likely to happen. We're trying to sketch out multiple different pathways to positive futures that people can then try and make those more likely to happen. So I'll just end there. And I guess the slides we shared, and I put some extra stuff in the end here, but you can find me at the Stockholm Resilience Center. You can also just Google the Seeds of the Good Anthropocene or the Biosphere Futures, or find lots more on IPBES. So thanks very much. And now I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much. And there will be a chance at the end before 1 o'clock to ask questions if you want to Garry. Sanna.
Great, it's my turn.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, cool. Thanks, Garry, for that presentation. I think a lot of what I'm going to speak to also touches upon some of the ideas that you brought up in your presentation. So I'm Sanna. I'm a PhD researcher in the MISTRA Environmental Communication program at the University of the Sunshine Coast. And my research is concerned with possibilities for equitable agricultural systems in the context of carbon farming. So I'm interested in how transformation comes about, equity and relationality in my research. And future studies has given a lot of theoretical and methodological tools to help me ask questions such as who is invited to make futures and whose futures get to be made. So during this talk, I'll just introduce how I use future studies in my research and how I think it's contributing to my work. So first, why futures? I became interested in thinking about futures from an educational perspective. Before starting this PhD research, I was working a bit more in education for sustainable development context, where we were asking ourselves this question of how do we prepare ourselves and our students for wicked futures? So futures like the ones Garry's been describing in his presentation. And someone that inspired me to think more deeply about this question from a pedagogical perspective was educational philosopher Deborah Osberg, who asks, how can we move into futures in radically open and non-colonizing ways? And what fascinates me is how can we create moments or processes like this? For me, these are questions that are fundamentally tied to our relationships. As Karen O'Brien argues, climate change is a relationship problem. So how we relate to each other, but also a planet that is alive, and how that shapes how we move into futures are questions that over time I've become very curious about. So there are two areas of interest that prompt the direction of my research and that warrant my choice of futures methods that I'm soon going to elaborate on. So first, what ways or places exist or need to be created to explore possibilities and pathways in a more inconsequential or risk-free setting where people can test out ideas without expecting to fix or solve the issues at hand? So in other words, how can we support the stakeholders that we're collaborating with in our research to experiment in ways that can help them figure out how they want to act in the real world? So how can we help them to build anticipatory imagination and capacities? Second, what are the experiences of stakeholders that are active in these carbon farming contexts that are part of my research? So these experiences are key, as decarbonization and climate change adaptation are not limited to technical strategies, but also involve deeper societal transformations where beliefs, worldviews, and values influence how folks see themselves in the world in relation to the so-called other, and also influence how we take action towards particular futures. So what are ways that could bring this type of depth to analysis and collaboration with our stakeholders? So to help approach these areas of interest and these questions, I'm using environmental futures and anticipation as theoretical frameworks in my research, in addition to using particular futures methods. So I'll be very brief here since I would like to focus more on the methods, but after the formal presentation, I'm happy to speak a bit more to these. So with the theoretical framing of environmental futures, we can see carbon farming as a growing construction site of futures and of human-soil relations. Humans are not alone in constructing and shaping futures, and carbon farming as a futures making practice is then an assemblage of different actors, so soils, plants, humans, animals, socio-technical apparatuses. So environmental futures thus invites us to decenter the human in the production of futures, seeing it instead as a socio-ecological production. Anticipation, though, helps us ask questions about how we think and act in the present to enact preferred futures. And it shapes our relationships to environments, including technology and non-human nature. So both of these theoretical lenses tell us about how we situate ourselves in relation to the other. And I'm using these framings to support workshop design, including gaming, which I'll speak to shortly, as well as to support the analysis of this research context, including how we think about sustainability, how we make change, our relationship to land and non-human, and the non-human and material. So quite practically, I'm approaching futures as a way to facilitate the exploration of our unconscious stories at play and how we think about and act towards certain futures. So to help me do this, I'm working with two futures methods, which I will introduce now. I'm still rather new to these methods, and while preparing this talk was really useful to wrap my head around some of this stuff, I'd be really curious to hear your insights and perceptions into the potential of these methods after the presentation. So the first method I would like to present is called causal layered analysis, which is a tool developed by critical futurist and philosopher Suhail in Ayatollah, with the aim of deconstructing problems through different dimensions and to problematize events, trends, or issues in ways that can help us reframe the problems. This kind of analysis acknowledges the many levels and dimensions of how realities get constructed, and in so doing aims to bring different ways of knowing and create layers between, create dialogue between these layers. It is a way to create space to support thinking of alternative futures, and over the past few decades has been adapted and applied in lots of different ways. You can read, for example, about how CLA has been used in the book CLA 2.0, Transformative Research in Theory and Practice, which has dozens of examples of its application. In my research, I use it to help make sense of the ways in which futures are anticipated in carbon farming practices and strategies, so in a deconstructive sense, but also as a tool to think about alternatives, so in a more reconstructive or constructive way. As a futures tool, CLA has been used to help groups transform by revealing the often hidden driving forces of issues, trends, organizations, etc., and to help illustrate patterns, structures, and aspirations that tell us something about who we are, where we have come from, and where we think we are going. And CLA is also really usefully used in conjunction with, for example, methods that Garry has presented us. So, for example, scenario building is a way of organizing thinking around that. So just briefly about these different layers, what are they? We first have, so the CLA is including 4 layers of analysis, and the idea is to move through and between these layers so as not to prioritize one layer over the other. At the first level, we have the litany level. This level focuses on mainstream or general knowledge regarding a topic. So it's more or less how we talk about or frame an issue, and is often called the headline level. So that can be sometimes called the official public description, or how the issue is talked about in the public sphere. And it's often quite present or short-term focused. Moving down, we have the system or structures level. And at this level, themes tend to converge around how we act in a particular context, and how contextual elements such as economic, cultural, political, and historical factors shape our behaviors. And it can be based on the social scientific explanations of quantitative data. Moving down at the worldview level, we find perspectives connected to why we think about specific challenges or topics in certain ways, which is of course influenced by our identity, culture, background, and values. And at this level, we're examining ideologies and discourses that underpin or challenge the different paradigms and mental models that we're working within. And finally, we have the myth or metaphor level, which explores the deep stories and collective archetypes that give meaning to these disconnected events that we might talk about at the litany level, for example. And these might manifest as visual images, emotional responses, and metaphors. And Inayatollah talks about this as the sort of gut or emotional level experiences, which is often the most difficult to talk about. So as an example, these are the types of questions one might ask at the different levels when it comes to carbon farming. For example, here in the middle column. And my goal with this is to analyze, so my goal with this kind of analysis is to invite reflection on how our different diagnoses or framings of problems or issues interact with each other, and what that might mean for how we approach this agricultural transformation that we're calling carbon farming. So what is it that we think we're addressing when we engage with carbon farming, and what are the ways that we think this should play out? So I see this really as a tool that helps create distance from the present, as a way to examine underlying assumptions, values, and myths, rather than just remaining on the visions or strategy level, which is arguably the place where we're hanging out on more on a daily basis. So because CLA can be a bit tricky to work with, I decided to do a CLA pilot workshop for myself to try to help myself sort through it. And I invited colleagues to a workshop, and here I'm just going to show you some of the prompts that I use as an example, which I think you all can also relate to, having been working or active in a university environment. So the prompts that I gave the group was the future of university education, with an invitation to imagine the future 30 years from now, zooming in specifically on grading or certification. So how do we know that students have learned, or how do we know that's what students know? And just as an example, here are questions that I developed for the different layers. So on the top question pertaining to the litany level, and the final question inviting reflection on the metaphors or images that might be associated with this kind of future university. But because this is a futures thinking exercise, I also invited the group to think about alternatives. So rather than just going down the triangle and stopping, going back up the triangle or the different layers and trying to reframe an alternative university. So there are practical ways to use this CLA in workshop settings, which offer opportunities for participants to think and play with multiple possible pathways, but also as a tool for analysis, which is how I've so far approached it in my research. However, I'm still hoping to use this kind of analysis to deepen and build the second futures tool, which goes by different names, serious games or games for change. The games share a lot of characteristics of foresight and futures tools, like working through simulations of present and future systems, but also exploring futures worlds. So we in the MISTRA team, along with a couple game design colleagues from Uppsala University, are engaging in an iterative process of co-designing a game for change together with carbon farming stakeholders, with the purpose of exploring this method to support action for better futures. Literature has pointed to the potential of serious games in working with wicked issues, and we have chosen this method for this quality as well as its co-creative qualities. So for us, it was important to avoid a game that was already preset and finished, as this could be prescriptive, and based on the prior experience and research by my colleagues, we wanted to engage in a process where stakeholders are actively involved in the game design, bringing their own experiences into play. So we explore this method then as a tool for transformative learning. According to the literature, serious games have the potential to work through the complex relationalities that converge and emerge in climate futures by engaging with stakeholders in more systematic ways. So games could, for example, include the interactions of ecological systems together with human social aspects, where the worldviews and paradigms that we bring are interacting with the landscape. Serious games have been shown to provide an intervention platform that facilitates cross-boundary interactions, can strengthen relationships among different kinds of stakeholders, and also promotes learning. And when it comes to learning about wicked challenges like climate change, games are processes that can provide supportive conditions for this type of learning. For example, some literature points to participatory approaches to scenario building that take into account things such as values and lifestyles, which can provide a way for continuous learning about these kinds of complex systems, as long as they're iteratively revisited, evaluated, and improved upon. Games might also provide a venue for thinking about inspirational stories or visions, which are important for thinking about sustainability transformations, and ones that move us past the so-called generic tropes. For example, technology will save us, and which can help us get more specific, can change our understanding and awaken us to commitments to make radical shifts. Vervoet and colleagues have written extensively about this and try to get really concrete in thinking about how to design games and providing guiding principles in the form of questions for game developers, particularly those working with anticipatory governance around climate and sustainability related issues. In their work, they provide really detailed descriptions of principles which they consider important for impactful and politically reflexive game design. And these are just some of the principles that we're working with. So we hope that in our iterative workshop series, we can support the creation of sort of active knowledge and new knowledge for our different stakeholders. We also hope that our game process can help enhance different kinds of futures literacies, critical futures literacies, or the ability to interpret and understand and see biases in existing futures, the ability to understand and imagine new futures, but also the ability to consider how futures could be realized in the present. Do check out their work on anticipatory gaming, as it gives a lot of food for thought around the different kinds of game design. And just to give a small taste of what we have been up to so far. We have so far had 2 focus group meetings and 1 game design workshop, where together with stakeholders, we have been co-creating the scene and working on some boundary conditions for the game. So the purpose of the game that we're working on in particular is to develop transformational pathways that lead to the sequestration of carbon, but also towards other co-benefits in a multifunctional agricultural system. The aim of the game is to sequester as much carbon as possible, and the stakeholder groups get to decide how to do this while navigating realities of socio-ecological systems. And this is just a picture from our first workshop, where we were working with different kinds of cards to prompt imagination and so forth. And now we continue to work closely with our game design colleagues to create a framing for the first series of prototyping workshops. And our next workshop is upcoming in October. That's all I had today, but thanks a lot for listening.